What up, Cavs Nation? I'm your host, Ethan Sands, and I'm back with another episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. Chris, it feels weird. We're getting more off days than I had anticipated over the last 17 games. Now you talk about everything that the Cavs have going on. The first 17 games being over the first 29 games. The next 17 being over the next 43 days or 40, depending on if the Cavs make it to the NBA Cup Finals. There's a lot to dissect, right? This is the first time that the Cavs are getting to do their own thing outside of playing games against opponents, which is interesting because when we talk about the the training camp portion of it, and these guys were excited to get onto that track and get to play against people that they aren't already associated with. How important do you think this training camp / practice time is for a team that is continuing to develop and continuing to try and get to their aspirations of a title contender?
Well, that's part of the reason, Ethan, why their start to the season going undefeated for the first 15 games was really, really impressive because, yeah, there were a lot of holdovers from last year's team. 13 of the 14 regular roster players were brought back, and that gave them a level of continuity. It gave them a level of familiarity, but it was also new stuff, new rotations, new lineup combinations, new offensive principles, new defensive principles. And there were supposed to be growing pains. There were supposed to be some slip-ups along the way. And I guess you could say that there were certain spots throughout the course of some of the games that they played in those 15 where the Cavs weren't playing their best basketball, but it didn't matter in totality. They were able to overcome that anyway. But usually teams that make coaching changes and do things in a different kind of way systematically, usually that doesn't lead to such a seamless transition. And it was seamless for the Cavs. And then you add on to the fact that it was such a condensed schedule that Kenny Atkinson was having to do different things as a coach. Like part of his responsibility as the head coach of this team was to figure out, okay, when are we going to leave these hotels to get to the arena? Are we going to do a walkthrough at the arena? Are we going to do a shoot around in the morning? What are we going to do about practice? If we're on the road in the middle of a road trip, do we stay one extra night in the city where we are, practice there, and then leave? Or do we leave right away and get to the new spot so that we can get extra rest? And he had to map out the schedule in a different kind of way. So all of that is being thrown at him as a new coach. All of that is being thrown at him in this new role that he was stepping into with this new team, all the while trying to implement these different things at both ends of the floor, and all the while, chasing a historic record from the Golden State Warriors of trying to go 24-0 to start the season. So it was a lot, and that's a long way of saying that this is really, really beneficial for the Cavs right now. This is really beneficial for Kenny. On one hand, like he had slid into a routine, the team had slid into a routine, and this kind of breaks that up a little bit, but it's a needed break. It's a welcome break, and this gives them an opportunity to work on end-of-game situations, to work on ATOs, to work on sideline out-of-bounds plays, to scrimmage one another at the end of practice to kind of get that competition going, and work through different things that have been an issue for them, albeit through wins, but problems that have arisen over the last 10 games, specifically on the defensive end of the floor and where they need to be spaced out and closeouts, all those different things that a team should theoretically have time for during the first month of the season that the Cavs have not had time for.
And Chris, it's so interesting that you mentioned ATOs, and we're not going to talk about that because, again, we like getting nerdy on this podcast, but this is not one of those times, right?
Yeah, so, it might be a little too nerdy there.
might be. But Kenny Atkinson walked into a press conference, a post-game press conference, with his little pad that he has with all the ATOs that he had ran in a game, and he had candidly said, like, And I forget who asked it, but someone was like, "What's that?" And he said, "These are all the ATOs that I ran." And me having the first question in post game, I was like, "Well, we can talk about ATOs the entire time if you want to," because like we want to know all those different things and what you're working on. Obviously, the intangibles are huge in those aspects, but
Yeah.
I think we want to look bigger picture here, and I'm looking really, really big here, Chris. This is going into the ESPN's early season awards that they released earlier on Monday. And I think there are a lot that I have arguments with, and there are things that I just think are downright disrespectful, right? So I'm going to start from the top, and we're going to work our way down. And I'm sorry to start with this, Chris, but MVP, right? And we've talked about this a lot over my year of being here and where Donovan Mitchell has fared in these conversations and all these different things, right? And I can agree with AD, or I can agree with the ESPN rankings for the top four, right? They have Nikola Jokic at number 1, AD at number 2, Jason Tatum at number 3, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander at number 4. And then they lose me, Chris. Like I like it's hard for me to see a team that is one not in contention, and we talk about this. We talk about this a lot, right, Chris? This is a team. This is an award. MVP is an award that is based on individual statistics, but it has been weighed in the past how the team is faring as a team statistically as well, right? So for me to see a guy like Giannis Antetokounmpo, sure, he is averaging the highest that he has in points per game in the season, right? All these different things. But the Milwaukee Bucks are in a lower tier than you would have expected them to be to start the season. That doesn't make sense to me compared to a player like Donovan Mitchell, who we've talked about being an MVP candidate, who is simply not on this list. And that throws me off because you have Giannis Antetokounmpo and Stephen Curry, who I agree should be on this list. It just depends on where it is, tied for 5th when it comes to the ESPN rankings. And Chris, Donovan Mitchell, I know he might not be having the numbers that he's had to start a season or to end a season that he may have wanted, but the efficiency that he's played at, the amount that he's been able to empower players around him, and then talking about the 17-1 record. There are, let me think, 2, maybe 3 teams that have 3 or more losses, right? 3 or less losses in the NBA thus far, right? So you talk about how he has impacted winning games. And we've talked about how that has impacted this award in depth before. Chris, I know the Cavs are starting to get NBA recognition. They're starting to get notice from other players, other teams, all these different things, and they're going to get their best shot from all these different teams. Why are the Cavs players that are creating this depth, creating this run, not getting the decency of even being on these kind of lists?
Well, first of all, we're only talking about one category right now. We're talking about MVP. And the only one that you can make any kind of argument for is Donovan Mitchell, right? Because he's the leader of the team. He's the leading scorer for the team. He is the focal point of this roster. He's their franchise player. But statistically, Ethan, he doesn't stack up. And I know what you're saying about their record. They're 17-1. But 17-1 is a reflection of the team. It's not primarily a reflection of Donovan and how great and impactful Donovan has been. So many of the conversations that we've had during this run for the Cavs is, who's it going to be on a given night? Is it going to be Darius Garland? If it's going to be Donovan Mitchell? Is it going to be Evan Mobley? Is it going to be Ty Jerome coming off the bench? Is it going to be Karis LeVert? You had the stat that in back-to-back games, there is yet to be somebody for the Cavs consecutively to lead this team in scoring. So this is a team-first type thing. And a lot of the other teams that you talked about, a lot of the other players that you've talked about are clearly head and shoulders above Donovan in terms of production, in terms of impact. Every single number that a voter tends to look at, the deep analytics that are supposed to determine a player's value, a player's impact on winning, Donovan's just not there. And I think he's going to run into a situation that Jason Tatum ran into last year for the Celtics. A lot of voters were saying, okay, how much is it really Jason Tatum when he's on a stacked team and he's playing alongside Jaylen Brown and Kristaps Porzingis and Derek White and Drew Holiday and Al Horford? Like, the Celtics are great. They're the best team in the NBA. At the time that we were having the conversation about what to do with MVP, it seemed like the Celtics were probably going to win the NBA championship. But Jason Tatum wasn't doing enough to stand out from the rest of his own team. And if you're having a conversation of is he even the best player, the most important player on his own team? How could you make the argument that he's a more valuable, more important player than Jokic, than Giannis, than Luka, than Joel Embiid at the time? And all these different guys that were in that same consideration. And I think Donovan's probably going to run into the same kind of situation in terms of value over replacement player. He's not in the top 20 in terms of estimated plus minus. He's outside the top 10, in terms of offensive box plus minus. Jared Allen has a higher number than him. So you just look at all these different stats that are supposed to measure winning and nightly impact and stuff, and Donovan just doesn't show up. He's not having the best year of his career. He's not doing enough to separate himself from Jokic, from Giannis, even from some of these other guys, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, that are also on this list that are probably going to get a little bit more consideration at this point in time. In saying that, it's a long season and a bunch of different things can happen, but I just don't think 17-1 is enough of a reflection on the greatness and brilliance individually of Donovan so far this year that you give him the edge over some of those other guys.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, Chris, because now we get into the individual statistics of all these other players that have to do with this ranking, right? And this is no longer about the MVP race, because I happen to be partially in agreement with you, because there is partially, yes.
I do thing too. You brought up the Giannis thing. I think a couple of things have to be pointed out here, because we got to be fair about this. Giannis is putting up huge numbers. He is doing things statistically that haven't been done in multiple decades. That's first and foremost. The other thing, the dirty little secret about Milwaukee, number one, they've won 6 of 7. Okay, so they're on the rise. They've turned the corner. They're starting to play a lot better. And during the time that they weren't playing well, look, they had some slip-ups along the way that were just baffling. Chicago, Brooklyn. But 4 of their first 8 losses were against either Cleveland or Boston. You're really going to hold that against them? That they got off to such a terrible start when that was the schedule that they were dealing with? So, I think, and they played Cleveland really, really close, by the way, and they played Boston pretty close, especially in the second meeting against the Celtics. So it was an underlying thing where, Milwaukee wasn't playing all that well, and Giannis and Dame were trying to figure some things out, and Chris Middleton wasn't out there, and Doc Rivers was looking a little bit baffled at what to do with his rotations and his starting lineups and stuff like that. But, half of their losses at the beginning of the season came against the two best teams in the NBA, and 3 of those losses were within 2 possessions. So, like, were they really underachieving that much? Again, the losses against Brooklyn and Chicago and Memphis and stuff like that, those are different conversations. But I think you see some positive regression here recently with Milwaukee, in part because of Giannis's individual brilliance, and in part because they've had a more favorable schedule as this season and as this month has gone on.
And I also think that goes back to what we were talking about yesterday about how it's different looking at the Cavs schedule. And you say, sure, in terms of what the analytics say, they have played teams that have been below 500. And then you mention the games that the Bucks have played, right? And that was at the time where they had played Boston and Cleveland, 2 of the best teams in the Eastern Conference, 2 of the best teams in the NBA by proxy, right? So that's another thing. So you can't take what the Cavs have done for granted either. I want to go on to, and I think you're accurate, I think Giannis Antetokounmpo has been playing out of his mind, right? I don't want to take anything away from him, but I'm saying what this award, MVP, to wrap this up, has been is it's always been, of course, an individual award, but it has also been based on how successful the team has been as well, right? So if you're telling me...
There's nuance to that.
There is.
I mean, like, when the Warriors won 73 games that year, Steph was clearly the best player, the most impactful player in the entire NBA, right? If Donovan was playing at that kind of level, where people had no choice but to vote for him, in part because of the way that he was playing and in part because of the way that the team was playing, it would be a different conversation. But there are just like no numbers aside from 17-1, the Cavs record, which is a measure of team against team. There just aren't enough numbers to support Donovan's MVP case at this point.
So let's move on to the next category, Chris. Let's move on from this topic. I feel like we have a lot more to talk about. The next one is DPOY, Defensive Player of the Year. And ESPN, the first 3, again, the first 4, I can understand. Victor Wembanyama, Anthony Davis, Draymond Green, Dyson Daniels. Oh my goodness, how good he's been on the defensive end. But
he leads the league in steals.
That's what I'm saying. And we talked about Darius and Donovan being in that conversation last year. But he's been head and shoulders above what they've been able to do so far. Then you look at tied for 5th place. It's OG Anunoby and Franz Wagner. And then you look at tied for 7th place. It's Evan Mobley and Jalen Suggs. So obviously I'm going to look at the 2 ahead of Evan Mobley, which is Franz Wagner and OG Anunoby. So Franz Wagner, for this season, averages 0.2 blocks per game and 1.7 steals per game. OG Anunoby averages 0.7 blocks per game and 1.6 steals per game. Evan Mobley, 1.5 blocks per game, 0.9 steals per game. If you add all those numbers up, Evan Mobley comes out on top, right? So, to me, what he's been able to do on the defensive end for his team, obviously a team that we've talked about recently, has not been great on the defensive end, right? But also a team that we've seen on X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it. There have been parlays that have been broken because of what Evan Mobley has done and not been credited for, right? So, Evan Mobley, what he has done, even without being credited for some of the other things that he has done, has better numbers than the players ahead of him in the tied for 5th range when it comes to the DPOY. Sure, I've said it, and I will say it again on this podcast. Victor Wembanyama and Evan Mobley, for the rest of their careers, will be bouting for that DPOY award. But, Chris, Franz and Franz and OG, man. Like, I don't feel like. I mean, OG is a different conversation. I feel like OG does belong in this conversation.
Yeah.
Franz, I don't feel like belongs in this conversation.
So you mentioned some of the numbers, but you only picked out some of the numbers. And I think that's the complicated thing when it comes to voters or when it comes to this thing that ESPN is trying to do. Everybody has different numbers that they're going to look at, that they're going to place a different value to. And some people may say, hey, like blocks, steals, rebounds, those kinds of counting numbers are really, really important when it comes to my vote. Other people might go a little bit deeper, right? They might look at defensive win shares. They might look at defensive box plus minus. I brought up dunks and threes estimated plus minus, defensive estimated plus minus. So yeah, some of those numbers are certainly favorable to Evan, especially when you're talking about him against Franz or him against OG. But defensive win shares, Franz is ahead of Evan. Believe it or not, he is. Wemby is ahead of Evan. Some of the other guys that you mentioned, Draymond Green, ahead of Evan. Defensive estimated plus minus, Evan is slightly ahead of Franz Wagner, but they're both in the 98th percentile. So it's almost negligible, the difference between them. You can look at defensive box plus minus. Like I said, you can look at defensive win shares. It's all about like what kinds of numbers do you value more? And there are some numbers out there that support the case of Franz Wagner and the kind of defensive player he is and the kind of impact he has. You're sitting there laughing. He's higher than Evan in defensive win shares and defensive blocks plus minus, and the Orlando Magic have a better overall defensive rating than the Cavs do. So you're right in terms of blocks and steals. You're probably right in terms of contested shots. But in terms of the numbers that have been created to try and measure impact, like there are some that do support other guys other than, believe it or not, there are other players around the NBA that are also really, really good individual and team defenders that are going to get some recognition and they're going to get some support from voters across the country. It's not only going to be the Cavs. Like, it's going to benefit the Cavs greatly. Right. That they're going to have the record that they do. But I also think the other thing that Evan runs into, and I'm not saying that I'd put Franz ahead of Evan in this conversation right now. I'm just saying that it depends on the numbers that you look at. And some numbers are going to support Franz more than Evan, and some numbers are going to support Draymond Green more than Evan and stuff like that. I still think the thing that you can't quantify is just the stuff that Evan does on a possession-to-possession basis and on a nightly basis that allows the Cavs to construct their defense the kind of way that they do, and the kind of chances that the perimeter guys can take because they know that Evan is back there and he's the ultimate eraser, and Evan can guard inside and outside, and Evan can protect the rim as the lone five-man, or he can be the help defender, the weak side defender, as the four-man next to Jarrett Allen. There's just so many different things that a coach can do schematically with a defense because of the brilliance, the individual brilliance of Evan Mobley. So if it's me, I'm putting Evan in my top three. There's no doubt about that because I think he's that level of an impactful defender. But it's really, really close, I think, with him and Draymond Green as that third guy. I think Wemby and Anthony Davis are 1-2. I think Draymond and Evan are very, very close. I think Dyson Daniels has a strong case because of the things that he does. But, like, Atlanta is also a really, really bad defense, so I think that's going to hurt him. The other conversation that is going to be had by voters when it comes to Evan specifically, Ethan, is it Jarrett? Is it Evan? And, like, how do we parse through that conversation when trying to figure out who's more responsible for the Cavs being a top 10 defense? And I think when you have two guys like that, they have a tendency to either steal votes for one another, or voters can't ultimately decide and say, all right, we're going to go with Dyson Daniels. right? Or they're going to say, all right, we're going to go with Franz because Franz is statistically the best defender on the third best defensive team, and all of the numbers support that enough. Or somebody is going to say, well, it's certainly not Steph Curry, Buddy Hield, Jonathan Kuminga, and some of these other dudes in Golden State, so it's going to be Draymond Green.
So, Chris, first of all, you continue to push me to my next topic when it comes to stealing votes from each other and all those different things. We're going to get to that, I promise. But like I said to start this topic, when it comes to the DPOY, I agree with ESPN's rating. Victor, Anthony, Draymond, Dyson, even Dyson has a legitimate case to be on this list, to be on above Evan Mobley, right? When it comes to, and you talked about this, and you mentioned it in your explanation, and I agree with you, when it comes to the defensive end, no team funnels offensive players to either Evan Mobley or Jared Allen, other than AD and Victor Wembanyama. That's it, right? Like, and sure, you can say like those two are at the top of that list. Like you said, you take Victor and then Evan and then AD, whatever. I think there is contention when it comes to those different things. When you talk about how much Evan impacts the defensive end, we can go back to last night's game and how he wasn't credited for a block, but I can go back and watch the video, and there were at least two that he had, right? So different things that go on when it comes to NBA scales, NBA stats. But when you and I've been watching How I Met Your Mother, Chris, lately. So
great show.
Great show. So throwing all of the stats out the window, I'm gonna say pause and throw all the stats out the window and say pause and strictly talk basketball, talk hoops with you. Like Evan Mobley, when it comes to the defensive end, when it comes to stopping defenders, when it comes to players driving to the hole, seeing Evan Mobley and saying, I'm not taking my chances. There's two players in the NBA, and I've mentioned them already on this podcast, that are above him or at the same caliber. Victor Wembanyama and Anthony Davis, and that's it. And obviously, if you want to throw Chet Holmgren in there, you can, sure. But he's injured. That's why this conversation has been a little bit different. But with what Evan Mobley is able to do on the defensive end and then create offensively, it's a different thing than what we talk about with all these other guys. Dyson Daniels, Draymond Green, all these other characteristics, right? But for me, when it comes to the layering of this, it's got to be Victor, AD, and then Evan. Whichever way you want to order it, go ahead. But those are the top three when it comes to defensive efficiency, when it comes to defensive identity, when it comes to helping the team create wins on that end of the floor.
Okay, so here's my question. And again, I'm not saying that I'd have Franz ahead of Evan, but you seem to have a problem accepting the fact that Franz Wagner has been a really, really impactful defender for the Orlando Magic. So if you were a voter, how do you parse through this idea that Franz Wagner ranks higher than Evan Mobley in defensive win shares and defensive box plus minus, and he's in the same percentile as Evan Mobley in terms of estimated plus minus on the defensive end of the floor, in terms of dunks and threes? And if I could pull up D LeBron, which is not working right now for some reason, another nerdy stat that some of these voters use, if I pulled up D LeBron, I would think that Franz, based on the other metrics, would also be ahead of Evan. And it's not just that he's ahead of Evan in these categories. He is top 10 in two of these, and he's top 20 in the other one. So, like, as a voter, how'd you just ignore that? Combined with the fact that Orlando's the third best defense in the NBA this year. Like, why will you not accept that Franz has a really good case, and the people that put this together are obviously using that data to support their argument here?
So very smart people, very very intelligent people, far more intelligent than I. Right? Obviously, I've been in this game for 2 years. What do I know? Listen to me. Listen to me not. But with what, and, I feel like I'm counteracting what we said about this Cavalier defense with saying this. But look at what Franz Wagner has around him. Whether you have Jonathan Isaac, Wendell Carter Jr., Jalen Suggs, KCP, right? All of those different players are defensively known. The only one that is probably more known for his offense than his defense in that lineup, obviously we know Paolo Banchero is out, could be returning shortly, is Franz Wagner, right? So sure, their defense is great. We've known them since the Eastern Conference first round last year, where Jared Allen joked it's the first to 96 or whatever you said. Like, we've known this is a team to be a defensive-minded group. That's why we thought potentially that either J.B. Bickerstaff was going to end up in Detroit or Orlando. It was one of the two, right? So now, thinking about how they've impacted winning, right? And obviously, defensive win shares is a part of that. And you're absolutely right when you talk about the stats. And like I said, pause, Chris. Throw that out of the window. Like, when you talk about the amount of games that they've been able to win, the amount of games that they have been questionable to win, sure, they had to adjust without Paolo Banchero in their lineup, all these different things. And we have a lot more to discuss. I'm sorry for people that are 30 minutes in and are going to have to listen to this. But, like, this is a team that is known for defense, right? And the Cavs are also known for defense, but it is because of Jared Allen and Evan Mobley that they are known for that. It's not because of Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, and whoever you want to throw in at that small forward position. If it depends, right? If you throw Max Strus, they're not. If you throw in Isaac or Dean Wade, it changes. But those are different things that I feel like we have to adjust to when it comes to this team. For me, I'm going to stick with what I said. It goes Victor, it goes AD, and then Evan Mobley. Depending on where you put it, those are the next two. Victor, and I've said this to begin the season, I've said it all year long, Victor and Evan Mobley are going to compete for the DPOY for the rest of their lives, for the rest of their careers. But I want to move on to the next topic because I feel like we've gotten into that at length, right? And this is the one, oh my God, this is the one that I wanted to talk about anyway, Chris.
Boy.
Six man of the year. And I have to contain myself on this one, Chris. And I know you already got stats pulled up to counteract me, whatever it may be. But Ty Jerome is not even on this list. Karis LeVert is not even on this list. That is what throws me off. Not who's on the list, who's not, whatever. The list goes Peyton Pritchard, Buddy Hield, Naz Reid, Bogdan Bogdanovic, Miles McBride, Trey Mann, TJ McConnell, and Russell Westbrook, right? MPI, like 6 man of the year, right? When you talk about all the things that go into that, Karis LeVert, Ty Jerome, impacting winning, Boston Celtics, right there with the Cavs, second best record in the Eastern Conference, one of the best records in the NBA, right? Ty Jerome has a blistering true shooting percentage of 73.6%. It is the best in the NBA coming into the games tonight, right? Minimum 100 field goal attempts. And then you talk about what he's been able to do off the ball, defensively, all these different things. I know we talked about it earlier into the season, what Karis LeVert has been able to do, what he's been able to impact, all these different things. He's been out for a while, so I understand him not being on this list. But Ty Jerome was in the conversation for Eastern Conference Player of the Week this past week, Chris. And when we talk about recency bias, and I feel like there's a little bit of that when it comes to this list, there's no reason for him to not get a single vote. There's no reason for him to not be on this list at all. He's had the best season of his career on the best team, arguably, in the NBA.
Yeah, I was surprised that Ty wasn't even on the list. I think part of it is he kind of was off the radar from the very beginning of the year, and his more explosive, eye-catching games have come in the last week or so. Before that, he was good, he was solid, he was steady, but there were some clunkers mixed in there. There were some low-minute games mixed in there. As the season has gone on, as we've gotten deeper into November here, his minutes are up in part because the Cavs have been missing some bodies and other guys have had to step up, and he's been thrust into a bigger role. He's had a bigger opportunity in terms of shot attempts, in terms of usage rate, in terms of touches, all that kind of stuff has come up more recently. Whereas some of these other guys have been doing it since opening night, basically, at that same kind of level. Like Peyton Pritchard is Boston's version of Ty Jerome, except for he's done it a little bit more consistently. He's done it a little bit better in certain areas. Higher points per game, shooting percentages right around what Ty's are. Workload right around, role right around that same thing. So I think as the season continues to go on, if Ty continues to play off the bench the way that he has over the last week and a half, he'll get some more notoriety. He'll get some more love as these things progress into the quarter point of the season and then the halfway point of the season, then 3/4 of the season as they continue to update these. And it's a running list as the season always goes on. Like, I think there will be more recognition for Ty. It's hard to quibble with Buddy Hield. Like, he's giving Golden State a bench for the first time in a while. Like, he has been a consistent performer for the most part off their bench. He has allowed Steph to not play as many minutes, Draymond to not play as many minutes. Golden State has been one of the better teams in the NBA, so it's hard to dismiss him. Tari Eason has been one of the most impactful players in the NBA on a per-minute basis. He doesn't get a ton of notoriety. He doesn't get a ton of consistency in terms of the minute department, and I don't think a lot of people are paying all that much attention to Houston, but he's a defensive menace. He's a really good rebounder. The impact numbers are really, really favorable to him. He's up there in defensive win shares. He's up there in defensive box plus minus. He's up there in value over replacement player. So tough to say that he's not deserving of being on that list as well. Naz Reid won the award last year, so of course he's going to have that built in, and he's putting up pretty good numbers. I just think these things can be hard, right? You can only put so many guys on your ballot. And I think another thing that Ty and Karras are going to run into is they're going to take votes from each other, most likely, because the Cavs bench as a whole has been really, really productive. It's been a strength of this team, strength in numbers. We're going to celebrate depth. So it hasn't only been like Ty Jerome that has stood out. Over the last week or so, it's been Ty who has stepped to the forefront with these eye-catching performances. But it's a little bit different when you're talking about Golden State, right? Like, it is Buddy Hield. Like, he is the sixth man for that team. He is the anchor of that second unit. When it comes to the Cavs, like, are you going to argue for Caris LeVert, sixth man of the year, or are you going to argue for Ty Jerome? You can't really argue for both when you can only fit three guys on your particular ballot for sixth man of the year. So, like, it's been Sam Merrill at times. It's been Isaac Okoro off the bench. It's been Dean Wade off the bench. I think the Cavs, Ethan, are a team, and people may not like this, but it's more of a collective. And I think because it's a collective approach to get to 17-1, I think when it comes to these individual-based awards, I think it's going to be hard for the Cavs. And I think there's going to be some pissed-off members of this organization at various voters, because individually, I just don't think they're going to get that kind of recognition, because it's more of like the sum is greater than the parts type setup for this team.
And for all the listeners watching on YouTube, seeing that Chris is trying to struggle to stay up in his seat, he is he is sitting in a rocking chair. I want you to feel free to lay back and do your thing.
I'm all over the place here. Somebody took the chair, and I don't know where it ended up.
But I've known this before the podcast. I was just trying to see if he was going to pull an old man and start rocking during the podcast. He did not. He was trying to stand bow-legged during the podcast. But all right, so I have two arguments for you, Chris, and we have another thing to move on to, and that'll be the last one. But these are my two arguments for this one. You mentioned Peyton Pritchard, right? And obviously. Yeah. I talked about coming into the game. I talked about going into the Boston Celtics game. I was excited to see if he was going to hit a buzzer beater, because that's what he's known for, right? But Ty Jerome plays 19 minutes a game. Peyton Pritchard averaged entering tonight's game 27.4 minutes a game. Ty Jerome has better points per game. He has more assists per game, and he has a better field goal percentage per game. Right? Along with, as we talked about earlier, a better overall team record. So if you're doing more with less, I would think, as a six-man, that would make a better case for you.
He is not averaging more points per game than Peyton Pritchard. He is not. He is having
you're right.
Less than Peyton Pritchard. So
I apologize.
That matters in this conversation.
You're absolutely right. Peyton Pritchard entering tonight's game at 14.5. Yes. Ty Jerome at 12.6. My fault. That's on me. That's on me. But when it comes to Bogdanovich, why is Bogdanovich in this conversation when you talk about him playing 4 games entering tonight?
Yeah, I don't get that one. That one was surprising to me.
He has
does not belong there yet.
He is 9% of first place votes. He had 5 points. He was tied for 4th place in this voting by ESPN, right? And this is where I like feel it as disrespect when it comes to the Cavaliers, and when it comes to, like, they get national attention now. Sure, you go on the best streak since the 24-0 Golden State Warriors. You're gonna get that, right? But I feel like there's not the individual basis that has led them to that, because, as you mentioned, it is a team game when it comes to this Cavaliers squad. They're able to decipher between who needs to go, who needs to take a step back, all these different things. And that also talks about what you were talking about with Karis LeVert and Ty Jerome taking scoring from each other, right? And that kind of goes into the final category that I wanted to talk about when it comes to this ESPN list, which was most improved player. And obviously we have a couple of Cavaliers on this list, but do they deserve to be as low as they are? All these different things. Dyson Daniels, number 1 on this list, 33% of first place votes. Jalen Williams, second on this list, 17% of first place votes. Cam Thomas, 3rd place, 17% of first place votes. Then you have Evan Mobley tied for 4th with 17% of first place votes. And then Jalen Johnson, 10 points. LaMelo Ball, 8 points, 8% of first place votes. And Ty Jerome tied with Cade Cunningham at 8% of first place votes. And I think when you talk about most improved players, Chris, you think about injuries, you think about players that weren't able to do what they wanted to the previous season, all these different things. And I went back as far as trying to figure out when the last time the NBA had a comeback player of the year award. And that was back in the 1980s. So I'm over here trying to figure out what is going on with this ESPN list, all these different things. And Ty Jerome being as low as he is, playing 2 games last season, and let's talk about this. Ty Jerome, and y'all can say I'm hyping him, whatever you want. I had a very small sample size coming in. It's been a surprise to me what he has been able to do, as it has been to even Kenny Atkinson on the offensive end. So blame me or blame the head coach. One of the two. Figure it out. Anyway, Ty Jerome being able to do what he has done, coming off of playing 2 games and only a part of the second game of last season, and then coming in and saying, okay, it doesn't matter what role I'm in, you can throw me in and be able to be one of the most impactful players on the Cavs when needed, right? And that's by a need basis. You talk about all these other players on this list, and I understand why the top of the list is what the top of the list is. Dyson Daniels, Jalen Williams, Evan Mobley, not so sure about Cam Thomas. I feel like Cam Thomas was supposed to have this kind of role. But Ty Jerome playing just 2 games last year sticks out to me. And most improved, comeback, whatever you want to call it, being able to raise your level to a different tier than what you had played at. Ty Jerome hasn't played in, I believe, 60 or more games in the season in his entire career. So we'll have to wait and see if he's able to obtain this stretch of his career, what he's been able to do to start the season. But in the entire season, Ty Jerome has scored 20 or more points just 6 times in his career. Right. He scored 20 or more points 4 different times in the last 2 weeks. If that doesn't scream out to you most improved, and I don't know when this ESPN article was written. It could have been written last week, could have been written today and scheduled for the morning, whatever might have happened. But when you talk about what Ty Jerome has done for this Cavaliers team, I don't care, and this is the question that I wanted to talk about in a separate podcast, Chris, but we're going to have to talk about it now. Mm-hmm. How many award competitions, when it comes to 6-man, most improved, all those different things, should Ty Jerome be in when it comes to his improved play this season?
Well, look, he's on this list for most improved, Ethan. He's among these guys. He also got 8% of first place votes. So it does feel like there is some level of appreciation for what Ty has been able to do, and rightfully so. You mentioned it. I don't know the right way to vote for most improved player. I'm still learning that as a voter. I don't know if you take a guy who's been terrible throughout the course of his career and then he just becomes marginally good. I don't know if you hold it against guys who are top 5 picks because there's just a natural progression and a natural evolution that they probably go through. So I don't know the right way to vote for most improved, but it does feel like Ty belongs in this conversation because he was a journeyman backup, barely rotation player throughout the course of his career. Before this year, that's the role that he had. He was on a 2-way contract with the Golden State Warriors a couple of years ago. Think about that. A 2-way with the Warriors. After being a first-round pick and just not finding a home in the NBA and not finding a consistent role in the NBA. And I do think there's some level of, and Kenny Atkinson brought this up earlier this week when talking about Ty, Ethan, there's this level of, okay, cool, you're doing it at a high level, but it's September training camp. Okay, cool, you're doing it at a high level, but it's preseason. All right, it's carried over to the regular season now. But it's not even 20 games into the year. It's not even December yet. You know what I mean? I think there's that element of how real is this? Is this a mirage? Is this a flash in the pan? Or is Ty Jerome just a different player? who's thriving with this opportunity, who's thriving in the system, who has a different level of confidence, who has renewed health. So I think there is that element of wonder around the NBA when it comes to Ty. But I think it's a good sign for him that he's already on this list, that he's already getting some level of recognition, because he does belong in the conversation for most improved player. Because like I said, this was a journeyman who has become a fixture of the every night rotation for the best team in the NBA. A journeyman who has become an integral piece of one of the most productive bench groups in the entire NBA. That they aren't this as a bench group without Ty Jerome, right? They aren't this as a team without Ty Jerome. So he deserves recognition. He's going to continue to get recognition, provided he sustains the level of play that he has shown at the beginning of this season.
And Chris, there's one.
But in saying all of that, like, he's not Jalen Williams from the Thunder.
Nope.
Like, there are levels to this.
100%.
There are different kinds of conversations. And you might sit there and you could say, well, Jalen Williams has been a good player throughout his entire career. Well, he hasn't been this level of good player. He's logging career highs in points, rebounds, assists, blocks, steals. He's playing center at 6'6" on one of the best teams of the Western Conference. He is a borderline all-star. So, yeah, he came into the NBA, and there were a lot expected of him when he came into the NBA because he was a lottery pick, and he had a good year last year, and he helped Oklahoma City get to the postseason last year. But, like, he has taken the leap. He has taken a third-year leap from good to borderline great, from, guy on the rise who is ascending the way that you would expect of a lottery pick to he's in the all-star conversation right now in the Western Conference. So we can't just assume that every single lottery pick 3 years into their career, Ethan, is going to become an all-star. It doesn't happen with every guy. And when it does happen with a guy, the way that it's happening with Jalen Williams, I think it's fair, in my estimation, to label him the front runner at this point. And it's going to be hard to chase him down, especially if he makes an all-star team.
Yes, and I agree with you, Chris. And obviously, this is why every category I preface with, there are guys above these players that I understand why they are there, right? I did not say that J-Dub should not be in this conversation. That would have been wild of me. I didn't say that. No, I said that Ty Jerome, I believe, to be higher in the category of where he stands, right? And obviously, Evan Mobley is also in consideration. So again, we have the same conversation of, are you taking votes away from your teammate, right? And Evan Mobley is taking a jump that everybody wanted to see, did not know if it was going to happen, but the expectation was there, right? So does that take away partially from what he's been able to accomplish, right? And again, and I want to end it this way. Well, before I get into the very last category that I think the ESPN actually got right, is that Evan Mobley, and like we've talked about for the entirety of this podcast, there is an element of individual statistics, right? And then when we talk about the awards that have been won in the past, obviously it is extremely early. We are not 20 games in. We're arguing about things that could change in the next couple of days. But the fact that Evan Mobley, Ty Jerome, Donovan Mitchell, whatever category you want to argue about, is a part of the best record team in the NBA, best arguable team in the NBA, whoever you're talking to, I feel like this team continues to show itself as one of the upper echelons of the NBA. And if you're saying that these awards don't manifest itself based on the teams that they have been a part of in the past, I feel like that wouldn't be accurate. But the last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to the ESPN awards, and I feel like it has to be mentioned because it's accurate, is where the Coach of the Year award lies. Kenny Atkinson is at the top of this list, 100% of first place votes, 60 points. And when you talk about what you're able to do when you make franchise history, when you make NBA history, when it comes to the best start for a coach in a new system, in a new franchise, that's where you're supposed to be. I feel like there shouldn't be any arguments for that one there, Chris.
No, there's not. I mean, this is a no-brainer. This is as no-brainer as it gets. I mean, he fits. I don't know how every voter approaches this particular award, but if we look back on recent history and the criteria that people use, he fits like every single one of those. It usually goes to a coach on a team that is perceived as an overachiever. And you can sit here and you can say, well, the Cavs came into this season and they were a legitimate contender and they won 99 games in the previous 2 regular seasons and they made back-to-back playoff appearances. But like they're at the top of the Eastern Conference. So again, there are levels to this. There are differences. There are layers to conversations and nuance to these kinds of conversations. Nobody across the NBA expected this. So the Cavs do fall into the category of overachieving team. So the coach is a big part of that. The other thing that people can look at is just the drastic difference that Kenny has made in terms of play style and in terms of success that the Cavs have had. Because this isn't a situation where they went out and make a couple blockbuster trades in the offseason. They're not the New York Knicks here, where they acquired Mikal Bridges and Karl Anthony Towns, and the evolution of the team or the growth of the team or the improvement from the team is more tied to the change in personnel. The only new player is a dude who can't get minutes, Jalen Tyson. I guess you could make an argument that Ty Jerome is new because he only played in 2 games, 15 total minutes last year. So JB Bickerstaff didn't technically have him, but he was on the roster. The only new guy is Jalen Tyson, who can't get minutes on this team. So Kenny Atkinson is taking the same players from last year's team that hovered around 50 wins and is now on a pace that is very similar to the dynastic Golden State Warriors. That is the definition of overachieving, and you feel his influence on the team. So there just like isn't a conversation about, hey, is it the coach? Is it the players? Like, how much is Kenny Atkinson responsible for the Cavs being 17-1 at this point? The answer is a lot responsible for them being 17-1, a lot responsible for them having the number 1 offense in the entire NBA. And so I think it's Kenny. Like, I look at Kenny Atkinson in the Coach of the Year voting the same way that I look at the Boston Celtics. Like, good luck beating that team. Like, good luck to anybody trying to chase down Kenny, provided that the Cavs don't have this complete and utter collapse, which I don't expect them to have because I don't think they're set up. I don't think they're a team that is set up to have that kind of collapse. I think they are real. I think they are really, really good. And I think because of that, they're going to be right around the 60 win mark, maybe 55 to 60. And people are going to look and say, yeah, Kenny Atkinson is a big reason for that. Now, there are other like people that you have to put on your ballot. I mean, how many people expected the Houston Rockets to be any good? They're first place in their division right now, you know? I don't think you can look at that and say like, well, it's a really talented team, so I expected them to be 12-6 through the first. No, I mean, I think you can look at Ime Udoka and the influence that he has had on that team, especially on the defensive end of the floor, right? So he's certainly in the conversation. You have to give some recognition to Joe Mazzulla, although that feels more like a talent-y type thing than it does a coach thing. JJ Redick is a new coach, So he's got the stench of that on him. And, if he takes the Lakers to the playoffs, a high-profile team, you say, well, obviously there's some kind of coaching influence there where he's not Darvin Ham, and the changes that they made at the head coaching spot, that's a good thing for the Lakers. And look at how JJ has gotten them to buy in, and look at his fancy ATOs and stuff like that, right? Like, those things are going to be part of the conversation, but none of those guys are Kenny Atkinson. Everybody else right now is playing for second when it comes to Coach of the Year.
And for everybody listening, this is my preface. This is my pre-warning at the very end of this podcast, as it should be.
Also, by the way, do not sleep on JB Bickerstaff getting in the top 3 when it comes to Coach of the Year. Man. Especially if he gets the Pistons. The Pistons, with the league's worst record in 2 straight years, if he gets them to like 35, a little bit below 500, it's going to be tough to overlook. He's not going to win it, right? It's going to take a lot for him to win it. But don't be surprised if he creeps into the top 3 on ballots, especially if Detroit continues to play really, really hard and not be the doormat that the Pistons have been the last couple of years. I mean, shoot, right now they're in the play-in conversation.
That's what I was going to say next.
Who saw that coming?
Man, not us. Not us, Chris. Right. Not us. But so, and that gets into what I was going to say to wrap up this podcast. If you listen to me and you go off based on my opinion and what I think on this, what I said on this show, great. I respect it. I appreciate it. I put a lot of work in and say what I do. I don't just be spitting nonsense. I promise that. But Chris Fedor is the one that votes for cleveland.com. So if you got money on the line, if you put in parlays in, if you want to go in and say, oh, this is the early season prediction for awards, that's the guy I would look at and listen to. Sure, I could end up be right, but I don't want to mess nobody's money up. You know what I'm saying? But also, for listeners that want to contribute to a survey about the podcast where you can give your feedback, go to tinyurl.com/WGpod. That's tinyurl.com/WGpod. With that being said, that'll wrap up today's episode of the Wine and Gold Talk podcast. But remember to become a Cavs Insider and interact with Chris, me, and Jimmy by subscribing to Subtext. Sign up for a 14-day free trial or visit cleveland.com/Cavs and click on the blue bar at the top of the page. This is where you can send in your personal questions to us and we can respond to you directly to your phone, or for tomorrow's episode of the Hey Chris podcast, you can send in your individualized questions directly to us and you can get a shout out on this podcast. But if you don't like it, that's fine. All you have to do is text the word STOP. It's easy, but we can tell you that the people who sign up stick around, because this is the best way to get insider coverage of the Cavs from me, Chris, and Jimmy. This isn't just our podcast, it's your podcast. And the only way to have your voice heard is through Subtext. Y'all be safe. We out.